move to how the number of schools have changed over time. This is much more interesting because it's not a static picture. You are getting a sense of where the parents are wanting to send their children. Where is it that the government, to what extent is the government actually increasing the number of government schools? And private schools will come up because there is demand, because private schools, if they would not run on loss. If they were running on loss for many years, they would have to close down. So the increase in number of private schools would necessarily be a reflection of increase in demand for private education. So let us see what has been the change in the number of government schools and the number of private schools over the period 2010 to 2016, the 6-year period, and this is all from DISE data. Now this is because I have taken this is raw DISE data from which I have made these tables. I have included only the private unaided schools and not the private aided schools. So we are comparing here the number of government schools, the change in the number of government schools over this 6-year period, and the change in the number of private unaided schools over this same 6-year period. So the answer to the question is that there were in 2010-11 10,35,602 government schools, and 6 years later, by 6 years later, that number had increased to 10,43,939. That means the number of the total stock of government schools in the country, elementary schools in the country, had increased by about 8,300 government schools. The total stock of government schools in the country, government elementary schools in the country, had increased by about 8,000. 8,000 more government schools existed in 2016-17 than had existed in the year 2010-11. What happened to the number of private unaided schools? There were 2,19,574 private unaided elementary schools in 2010-11, and the numbers increased to 3,15,990 by 6 years later. That means the number of private unaided schools, the increase in the number of private unaided schools was 96,416 extra schools existed, private unaided ones, in at the end of that 6-year period than there had been at the start of that. So the increase in the number of government schools was 8,300. The increase in the number of private unaided schools was 96,000. Right. So 12 times as many private schools came into being as the number of government schools that came into being. And of course, there's a lot of interstate variation. Uttar Pradesh is a complete outlier. For instance, in Uttar Pradesh, the number of private schools that increased over this period is 42,874. So out of this 96,000 schools that increased in the country as a whole, 42,000, nearly 43,000 were on account of the increase in the number of private unaided schools in Uttar Pradesh alone. The other states that had large increases were Rajasthan, where nearly 11,000 more schools came into being, and at the start of the period there were 26,700 private unaided schools in Rajasthan. By the end of the 6-year period there were 37,500 or so, 37,506 schools. So an increase of nearly 11,000 schools. There are other states in which proportionately the number increased greatly, and we can say, for example, Bihar, the number of private unaided schools really increased tremendously from its base, and so forth. Although the proportion of children attending private schools is still low in Bihar, but the number of government schools increased massively from a very, very low base. There had been hardly any private unaided schools before. So let's go on next to the change in student enrollment over this period, right? So what was the total enrollment in government schools and what was the total enrollment in private schools in 2010-11, and how did that change in the 6-year period to 2016-17? The situation for the country as a whole is that in the year 2010-11, in government schools, we are only talking about elementary schools. In government elementary schools in 2010-11, there were 12 crore 62 lakh children. By the year 2016-17, that number had fallen to 10 crore 78 lakh students. That means it had fallen by 1.83 crore or 18.3 million children abandoned government schools in this 6-year period. Where did they go to? Well, by and large, they seem to have gone to the recognized private unaided schools because the number of children studying in recognized private unaided schools increased from 4 crore 43 lakh in the year 2010-11 to 6 crore 13 lakh children by 2016-17. That means an increase of 1.7 crore. So, 1.83 crore children left the government schools over the 6-year period, and 1.7 crore children joined the private unaided recognized schools. Obviously, the remaining remaining 13 lakh or so children have joined other kinds of schools. It could be private unaided unrecognized schools. It could potentially even be aided schools in theory, but it seems more likely that it will have been the private unaided unrecognized, non-recognized schools. So, what has been the implication of this? I'm talking to you about a lot of data, but let's just tease out the implications of what is the meaning of this. What it means is that if this massive number of children have abandoned the government schools, have left the government schools, there's this exodus from government schools, what will have done to the average size of government schools? So, the answer is that before, at the base, my starting year is 2010-11, the year 2010-11. In the year 2010-11, the average size of government schools was 122 children per government elementary school in India. 122 children per government school, that was the average size of government elementary schools. 6 years later, by 2016-17, the average size of government schools fell to 103 children per government school. So, from 122 children in 2010-11, it fell to 103 children by 2016-17, a reduction of 19 children per government school. Now, because the number of government schools is 10.5 lakh roughly, 10 lakh 50,000 roughly, multiply that by 19 and that is the number of children that you've lost. It's a huge number of children to have abandoned the government sector. What is the situation in the private schools? Well, in the base year 2010-11, the private unaided recognized schools, the average size of such schools was 202 children per private unaided elementary school. By 6 years later, this also fell, but it fell modestly to 194 children per private school. That means there was a reduction of 8 children per school, and that seems to be because there has been such a massive increase in the number of private schools that there is more competition, and therefore the number of children per school has gone down to some extent. So, that is the situation when it comes to this. Now, let us look at this issue of the emptying of government schools a little bit more closely, and because it's a very, very interesting phenomenon. One would want to see exactly what has happened to certain parameters when you go inside the school. What has been the meaning of when children have abandoned the schools, the government schools? What has done? How has it changed the number of teachers? Has there been a change in the number of teachers? What has it meant for total pupil-teacher ratio, for example? What has it meant for teacher salary per student? So, which you could say is a measure of the per pupil expenditure, at least on the teacher salary head. What has been the change in that as the children have left government schools? And what I can take you through is that I can compare the year 2010-11 with the year 2016-17, again the 6-year period. In the year 2010-11, as I said before, there were 10.35 lakh government schools, 10,35,602 government schools, and out of these 10,35,000 or so schools, you will be surprised to know that exactly 30% of these schools were very small. They had only 50 or fewer children in them, in the school as a whole. Out of the 10,35,000 government elementary schools in the country, 3,13,169 schools, government schools, had total of 50 children or less than 50 children. Less than 50 means that some of them had maybe 5 children, some of them maybe had 35 children, right? So, taking all the government elementary schools that had 50 or fewer students, if we take the total number of such schools, the total number of such government schools was 3,13,000 schools in the year 2010-11. How did that change by 2016-17, 6 years later, the number of such schools by the total enrollment in the school as a whole was 50 or fewer children. That number of such government schools had increased to 4,17,193 government elementary schools. In other words, it went from exactly 30% to exactly 40% of all government schools that are so small as to have less than 50 or fewer children. Just think about it, 50 or fewer children in the school as a whole. What does it mean for number of children per class? If it had been the case that absolutely all of the government schools were only primary schools, and these are elementary schools going from grade 1 to 8, but of course a high proportion of them, maybe 2/3 to 3/4 of all these government schools are primary schools, and maybe about 1/3 of them are have upper primary schools as well. That means they have grade 6, 7 and 8 as well. So if it had been that every single one of these schools had been primary only, they only had grades 1 to 5, you divide a school that has 50 children in it, divided by 5 classes, it means that it has only 10 children per class. But that's if it had exactly 50 children, right? 50 or fewer means it can be even less. So what is the average number of children in these 4,17,000 government schools that have 50 or fewer children? The answer is 28 children per government school. So 4 lakh, I'm going to repeat this statistic because I want you to absorb this very interesting statistic. The number of government elementary schools that had fewer than 50 children, that number was 4,17,000 government schools that had fewer than 50 children. But the average number of children per such school was 28.4 children per such government school, which had less than 50 children in the school as a whole. So if there's on an average 28 children in each one of these 4,17,000 schools, it means that if all of them were only primary school, you'd have to divide 28 children by 5. Even if it had been 30 children divided by 5, it's 6 students per class. It has to be less than 6 students per class, 5.5 students per class. But we know that many of these schools, 1/3 at least of these schools, have upper primary classes. They also have grades 6, 7 and 8. In other words, there's all grades 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you have to divide 28 by 8 in the case of those 1/3 of the schools, right? So it is, in other words, on an average, there's about less than 5 children per class in these 4,17,000 government schools. The meaning of this statistic is quite substantial. It's quite surprising that there can be so many government schools that have emptied to such an extent that the average number of children in each class is less than 5. And if we look at those schools that are tiny, I am defining here arbitrarily, of course, a school as being tiny if the total number of children in the school is 20 or fewer. If the total number of children in the school as a whole is 20 children or less, I am defining those government schools as tiny government schools. What is the number of such schools and what happened to the number of such schools over this 6-year period? Well, in 2010-11, the number of government schools that were tiny, that had less than 20 children, was 71,189. This is all from DISE data, government's own data. By 6 years later, by 2016-17, the number of schools that were tiny, government schools that were tiny, increased from 71,000 to 1,16,000. So there was this very large increase in the number of tiny schools as well. The average number of children in these 1 lakh schools, 1,16,000 schools in 2016-17, the average number of children in these such schools was 12.6 children per school. And even if you imagine that all of them are primary schools, divide 12.6 by 5 classes, and you have, there's about 2.5 children per school in these 1,16,000 schools, 2.5 children per class in these 1,16,000 government schools. So there is a problem here. The problem is of huge amount of inefficiency. Obviously, if you have got on an average 2.5 children or less than 5 children in a class, it is pedagogically unviable, and of course it is also economically horrendously unviable. To look at the extent to which it is economically unviable, let's just look at the number of teachers in these schools and then use the average salary of teachers to come up with the total teacher salary expenditure, and then divide that by the number of children to get the per pupil expenditure on teacher salary head alone. And that's what I can tell you based on the calculations that I have done. So in the year 2010-11, if we were just talking about, how one can at the very least cost the, what is the cost to the taxpayer of running schools that are so small, when children have abandoned schools and the total enrollment numbers have fallen very low. What is the per student cost? So, we know the number of children, we know the number of schools that are that small, we know the number of teachers that are appointed in those schools, we know the number of students that are studying in that school. So, we can calculate by knowing the teacher salary levels. I'm so sorry, I'll just put this down. I'll have to start again because I've made a rustling noise. Okay, so from the figures that are presented in this table that I've just talked you through, we can very well calculate the per student expenditure on teacher salary head. The way we can do that is because we know what is the total number of schools that have, let's say children, 50 students or fewer. We know that there are, in the year 2016-17, 4,17,000 schools, government schools, elementary schools, that have less 50 or less, fewer than 50 children. Now, we know that there are 9,85,051 teachers in these schools, all from DISE data. We know that there is 1,18,59,775 children studying in these 4,17,000 small government schools. So, what do? We have information from a study by Vimala Ramchandran, professor of at NUPA at the time when she did this study. She has done a study of 9 different states of India in cooperation with the SCERTs, the State Councils of Education, Research and Training, the state equivalents of the NCERT. With their cooperation, she did the study on teachers in 9 states. She has presented a table in her paper about the teacher salaries in these states. The teacher salary at the start of somebody's career, when they just walk in, on day one, what would be the salary of the teacher. She's got all this data for the year 2014-15. In that year, what was the starting salary in each of these states? What is the salary of a teacher 15 years, who has 15 years of experience in the year 2014-15? And what is the salary of a teacher who has 25 years of experience in the year 2014-15? Who has already been working by the year 2014-15, who has already been working for 25 years. So, a teacher who in that year has worked for 25 years, what is her salary? A teacher who in that year has already worked for 15 years, what is her salary in the year 2014-15? And a teacher who starts in the year 14-15 itself, newly. And when you add up when you look at the amounts of these salaries, what I have done is to take a teacher with 15 years of experience, the salary of such a teacher, as being the average salary of all the teachers. Because in the system at any time there are some new teachers, some teachers who are experienced for 1 or 2 or 5 years, some that are experienced for 10 years, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40 years experience. If somebody started teaching at the age of 20 and they retire at the age of 60, they've been in the system for 40 years. So, what is the average teacher salary? Well, what I have presumed to be the average teacher salary is the salary of the teacher who in that year has already worked for 15 years, because that's convenient, that's something that Vimla Ramchandran has reported. So, it turns out that in the year 2014-15, if I take the average of all the salaries of all the teachers who have worked for 15 years across all the states for which she has reported this data, the average salary was for primary teachers, grades 1 to 5 teachers, was 29,312 rupees per month per teacher, a simple average of her reported salary numbers. But that was for the year 2014-15. My figure here of number of schools is for the year 2016-17, the number of schools that are small. So, how do I get from 2014-15 to 2 years later in terms of salary numbers? The way I can do that is I can find maybe some state of India for which I do know the salary, not only for 2014-15, but also for 2015-16 and for 2016-17. The state for which I do know that information is Uttar Pradesh. In Uttar Pradesh, in that year, 2014-15, in which Vimla Ramchandran did her study, teacher salary was about 29,300. But 2 years later, it was, it was increased by 8.5% in each of the years, 2015-16 and then 2016-17. So based on calculations like this, I have been able to calculate what is the total expenditure of the government on teacher salary, okay, across India, because I have presumed that the teacher salary figures reported for 9 states by Vimla Ramchandran, I am presuming that for India as a whole, government school teachers got that pay, right? And then I am extrapolating it by 2 years by an escalation rate of 8.5% in each of those 2 years, because in Uttar Pradesh, that is the rate at which they escalated for 2 years. I have information from one state and I am ascribing that to the country as a whole. So these are simplifying assumptions, but at least there is a basis for this. These are not arbitrary numbers. They are based on at least one state and based on some numbers that exist, pre-exist. So when we do that, what is the answer? The answer is that in these 4,17,000 small government schools, the number of teachers, as I said, was 9,85,000, and based on the teacher salary numbers from Vimla Ramchandran's, the total expenditure by the government on these 9,85,000 teachers was 56,530 crore rupees. And when we divide that by the number of children, which was 1,18,59,000 in these 4 lakh schools, the per student expenditure in the year 2016-17 was 47,664 rupees per child on teacher salary alone, which is 3,972 rupees per month per child on teacher salary head alone. Of course, there will be expenditure on other things in government schools. There is free midday meals, there is free uniform, there is free books, there is teaching learning materials, there is chalk and dusters and cleaning materials and other. So by the time you take those, obviously the figure will be well over 4,000 rupees per month per child. We don't know exactly how much more these expenditures would cost, but it could be 4,500, it could be, it's really impossible to put a number. But from this kind of a table, what we can get is the per student expenditure on per child in schools that are so small. This is an exercise that you can do yourself as well, and I would encourage that you play around with the numbers. Use the DISE published state report cards and district report cards to analyze the data and come up with some figures of your own, because DISE data state report cards also show the percentage of schools that have fewer than 50 children. So you can triangulate the data that I am mentioning with your own inspection of the published DISE state report cards. So shall we move on then to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is at the moment we've talked about India as a whole, what happened in this period of 2010-11 to the 2016-17 year. In this 6-year period, what happened to the number of government schools that were small or tiny. Small is fewer than 50 students in the school as a whole, tiny is less than 20 students in the school as a whole. And if we just looked at the figures by different states of India, what we find is that the speed of emptying of government schools is quite rapid in certain states, but it's less rapid in other states. There's quite a lot of interstate variation.